All right. Can you introduce yourself for the tape?
Yes, my name is Dr. Andres Lopez. I use they, he, and el pronouns, and I'm the research director at the Coalition of Communities of Color in Portland, Oregon. And I believe that community data can save us.
All right. Well, can you give us a sense of when you talk about community data, what do you mean by that? How should we understand it relative to other potential data sources?
Yeah, well, community data is data that's generated by, for, and used on the terms of community about their everyday lives. So it really is a reflection of community centric forms of knowing, being, doing, and dreaming. It can look like numbers, words, art, music, maps. It really just sort of encompasses the diverse ways that communities share and express their truths, their lived experiences, and their desires for the future. And of course, our goal is to make it as systematic as possible, and that community is part of interpreting that and defining how that information is used.
Dr. Lopez, can you give us a sense of, give us an example of the way that you're using community data in a community to help and improve the well-being of that community, and maybe how that differs from the traditional approach that we have to the way we might study a population to try and get the same ends.
Yeah, thank you. Um, well, there's a lot of challenges with how data is used to understand reality and to make decisions with. Governments typically rely on administrative data or census tract data, large sort of population level data. And then when you get more to the local level, there are things like listening sessions and community engagements, and of course, public testimony, right? Those are a lot of ways that community shares their truths with governments. However, they don't do a good job of tracking those truths, of aggregating those truths, and of actually using that to make better decisions and to improve the lives of folks. So most decisions made by government are actually not data informed. They are usually paired with data to sort of make a case or argument why the decision was made, but not really informed by people who are experiencing those sort of everyday realities when it comes to how we use transportation or how we get food or how we manage the healthcare system, right? For example. So I can give you an example of one way in Oregon that community is really rallying together to collect more data. So in the eastern part of our state, in the lower Umatilla Basin, there are a lot of communities there who are experiencing a multitude of health issues due to polluted groundwater and a lack of clean drinking water. Of course, these are areas that are heavily conventionally agriculture farmed and also mostly Latinx. 40 to 60% of the population of folks living in these communities are Latino, Latina, Latinx. And there's very little dominant data. We use dominant data to refer to the data that governments often rely on, which I sort of started this talking out here in this section. But there's some data like well water, for example, that helps us understand pollution, but not data about stillborn deaths and about asthma and about skin rashes and about how the local population refuses to drink the water and they buy water bottles at Walmart instead, right? There's not a lot of evidence to actually describe what's happening there, the impact it's having on people's health, and ultimately what solutions need to be implemented in order to make changes so that people are not experiencing that kind of oppression. So that's one example in our state and the water justice work that we're doing across the state, where it's really harnessing community data for positive impacts.
I really appreciate that example, and I want to read people into some of the ways that folks who think about different kinds of data have thought about them, sometimes in contraposition and sometimes in communion, in order to set up my next question. So I'm an epidemiologist, and we are on the quote unquote hard side of data. We rely on larger data sets with very systematic data collection. Now, there are a lot of limitations to the kind of inference that you can get from these kinds of data. The only answers to questions you can actually get are the ones that have data points collected on them, and that leaves huge swaths of potential rich information out there that you're not systematically collecting on. a lot of times, we are much more interested in the size of a data set than the nuance of a data set too often, which means that we will trade out getting these particular variables that may differ in a particular community for getting a broader sample of data against which you can now compare different parts. And we use statistical tools that tend to lack a certain level of complexity in order to try and get at answers to questions. And so it leaves us getting pretty broad but pretty shallow inference in epidemiologic data sets. On the other side, you end up having qualitative data where you can get very, very nuanced information in the verbiage that people use, but usually from a small number of people and in ways that are not as generalizable. And that generalizability question really is the axis on which these two groups will differ. Now, people tend to be very partisan about which of these tools is the right tool because people tend to have spent a lot of time studying how to use these tools, but they're just tools. And in the end, you have reality, and then you have whatever model you want to use to try and tell you something about reality, knowing that all models are wrong, but some are useful.
Mhm.
And so in your approach, I can imagine folks who engage in data science day to day will hear you violating the assumptions in both models, right? Which is to say, you want rigorous quantitative data and you want to admix it with rigorous qualitative data. So what kind of inference are you trying to make and how generalizable do you want to be? And what I hear you saying is actually, I don't really quite care about the answer to the question writ large. I care about an operational answer to a question that affects and helps the community that I want to affect and help, right? My question here, having given you a really, really long wind up, is how do you think about, right, your approach to community data vis-a-vis the traditional models that we think of in data analysis? And how do you speak to these different groups of people when you identify answers to the questions that they would naturally ask you about, well, how generalizable is your model, or how specific can you get if you're trying to mix quantitative and qualitative data?
Yeah, thank you. So I'll start with saying that what we need for better decision making is a diversity of data. This notion that there is like the right or best metric or approach to understanding something is very flawed. And we're also dealing with really complex social problems. So why would we rely on one tool or one approach to make broad decisions with millions of dollars that are going to affect millions of people, right? That doesn't make sense. So I'm not arguing for one over the other. I'm saying we need both and more. We need all the evidence that we can generate about what's actually happening in people's everyday lives so that we can be better informed to make those decisions. So I'll start there. Second, the generalizability question is always very interesting. You're spot on. That comes up all the time when we're talking about evidence, right? And what's trustworthy. The problem with quantitative generalizability is that it typically lines up with a number of individual units that are supposedly representative of a racial group or category that is actually made up. So you're saying, oh, if we surveyed 35 Black folks in Portland, because Black folks make up 2% of the population and that number aligns with our sample, then that's representative. And I actually don't think that's really generalizable over a group of a community that is not bounded by this sort of category, right? So I really challenge this notion of quantitative generalizability, especially across racial groups or other social groups. So and what I would say about the qualitative is that it actually gives us more information about what to do. So, how do we respond to a disparity that we're seeing from a quantitative metric? What is most desired by a community? What has failed in the past that needs to look different, right? Quantitative metrics don't tell us how to do that. All they do is point out gaps and disparities for certain populations, but not how to move forward. So we actually invest so much money in maintaining these metrics and having longitudinal data sets to make these claims that we're having population level shifts and changes without actually having the context of understanding for whom and to what extent and what we should do next to actually improve that, right? So my answer is we need both of them, and that we should get away from this notion that it's generalizable, and more that each tool has its own strength. And the more of them that we can use and the more evidence we can bring, the better we can be about making better decisions, especially when it's grounded in lived experience. So if we have a survey that's capturing how people feel about homelessness in your region, or how often they've eaten this week, right? Those metrics can certainly tell us about maybe how some groups are doing over others, or how certain groups feel about certain realities. But it's not always grounded in their own experience. Have you been homeless? Have you gone a week without eating? Right? Why are we using evidence that's not actually grounded in lived experience of people who are experiencing these things we want to shift, instead sort of broad metrics that are supposed to help us make the best decisions? So I really think we need a diversity of data, and communities' language is words. People talk about their experience and their truth through words, and one story from one person isn't anecdotal. I always sort of really get frustrated when I hear this term anecdotal, because anecdotal literally means not grounded in truth. You're literally saying the story of my abuela and how she's experienced inequality in this region is not grounded in truth, and that's not right at all. And actually, her experience is connected to all kinds of things. It's connected to all kinds of social structures, right? It's connected to how our food systems work. It's connected to how neighborhoods are organized. It's connected to who has access to what jobs and what income levels, right? So one story is actually a structural story, and it tells us a lot more. So
Mm,
I think we really hurt ourselves by leaning into this idea of generalizability, as
yeah.
opposed to thinking about evidence more broadly.